Hello, everybody. Good evening. It's late in the evening in Ireland and it's very early in the morning in Sydney, where Dr. Tim Anderson is joining us from. Tim, you're very welcome here. Uh, at the start, we were explaining just before we started to record this message of Iran is winning, and then the discussion is why Iran is winning. So most of us are in agreement that Iran is winning. Um, and it's very clear to us, but for some people who still are asking questions, what's really going on, I think it's important to have experts like yourself here. So thank you for joining us. And just to remind everybody who's watching right now as we go live, but also afterwards, that Dr. Tim Anderson was recently in Iran, and many people might have seen the video of yourself, Tim, sailing down the Strait of Hormuz. It was quite, I personally found it a wow moment of, my God, look at what they're doing. And, all of the news that comes out of from Western media anyway, how it paints such a very different picture. So the title of tonight's program is Why Iran is Winning. And Tim, I'd love if you could respond to that question.
Well, thanks, Roisin. Welcome, everyone. And I'm sorry about the mix-up. We miscalculated the time difference a little bit. Anyway, yes, of course, this hybrid war is an information war as much as any other war, really. We know there's huge amount of misinformation coming out of the US and the White House in particular, which is mortified by the failure of its first round against Iran. Unfortunately, we're now sitting on the doorstep of a second round, it seems, because there's been a huge US military build-up, and it looks like there's a good chance that the US is going to attempt a second round of war against Iran. I can tell you a bit about my experiences in traveling through wartime Iran. There was a small group of us observers, most of us journalists, who entered by land from the north. Normally, you would fly in from the Persian Gulf, but of course, as you know, the war has stopped most of the airports functioning, although Iran's airports are functioning again now. But anyway, we came overland from the north and then traveled from the northern city of Tabriz down to Bandar Abbas, which is on the edge of the Straits of Hormuz, and interviewed people who were involved with that re-regulation of Hormuz, which is really one of the great unexpected elements of this war. Basically, it was open before the war, of course, and then somehow or other, one of the key objectives of this war from Washington's side has been the opening of the Straits of Hormuz, which were open before the war began. So it's an extraordinary situation where really the US has given to Iran a new tool, basically, to have significant leverage on the global economy, and it hasn't been able to take it back. Basically, this is one of the signs of how Iran is prevailing in this conflict so far against a much more powerful enemy with the type of asymmetric warfare that it's been speaking about for some decades, basically. To go to first of all, to the general theme, why Iran is winning, of course, we know that the Israelis have wanted to destroy Iran, destroy and dismember it. Basically, the Islamic Republic is a thorn in its side, financing all of the independent resistance movements in the region. Basically, Trump never set out any clear objectives of his war, and that's one of the reasons why he lost the support of many of the Europeans and almost all of the Asians, basically, who are the ones that depend on the Persian Gulf for their energy supplies. But Trump hasn't managed to destroy the republic or the nation, despite the tremendous firepower that the US has. Of course, the US is a long way from home. It's got significant logistic problems with resupply of its ammunition, not least the anti-missile, anti-drone interceptors, similarly with the Israelis. Whereas for the Iranians to win, they have to do three things. They have to survive, they have to inflict serious damage on the enemy, and force the enemy to retreat, basically. And they've done that so far, at least in the first round. It remains to be seen what's going to happen in the second round. But really, the tour that a group of us managed to have through Iran showed a couple of things. One was that the US was conducting a type of systematic terrorism against Iran. That is to say, there was no ground war, no naval war either, really. Basically, a series of attacks from the air, mostly on civilian targets. Of course, the ones we saw were mainly civilian targets. Even some of the military officers who were assassinated, one of them we saw in Isfahan was, they waited until he went home so they could kill his entire family with them. You're all aware of the attack on the school at Minab, which we visited, which is about 2 hours southeast of Bandar Abbas. That was carefully planned. There's a former anti-terrorism US officer who said that they knew exactly, confirmed that they knew exactly that it was a school. It had been an army compound 20 years ago. The school was created 13 years ago. The satellite intelligence would have made that very clear. Even the Tomahawk missiles themselves have real-time feedback video loops. So it was very clear they knew it was a school at that time of day, 11 in the morning, full of school children. They knew that very well. It was a deliberate act of terrorism. It wasn't the only attack on a school in the first days of the first round of that war on February the 28th. We visited a young boy, a 12-year-old in hospital in Shiraz, whose leg was shattered by something that they call a new precision weaponry fired from Bahrain. The US has a huge naval base, or had a huge naval base in Bahrain. It's destroyed now. But that young man was part of soccer teams that were hit on the sports field by the US in the early days of that last round of the war. So really, and there's not just one or two schools that were hit or one or two hospitals that were hit. There were dozens of them hit in that 40 days of war of the first round of this war there. As I said, I was with some journalists and videographers from Turkey, from Greece, from the US, who toured from the north, from Shiraz down to Tehran, to Isfahan, from Tabriz to Tehran, to Isfahan, to Shiraz, to the Persian Gulf at Bushehr, and then down the coast past the South Pars gas field to Bandar Abbas, and then to Minab, and then we caught a train back up the center of Iran to Tehran and exited through the north again. The Iranian media are doing these tours. It's possible for people to apply to join one of these tours. They're still happening, so far as I know. I can send you the contact numbers of the people that are organizing them if you want to see it, basically. But it's a strange war, as a bakery owner told us in Tehran, in Nilufar Square. We were at Nilufar Square where there was a terrible massacre, and it was because they destroyed a police station. Now, we had no detail of the people killed in that police station, and we couldn't film that police station for security reasons, but I don't know how it helped the war effort, basically. But the people killed were killed in the cafe and the residences across the road there. And this is a pattern you see through the cities. You know, they were with the munitions that they were using, with the missiles, with the drones, with the bunker buster bombs that they dropped on some of the cultural heritage in Tehran and Isfahan. The shock damage is huge. In the Gandhi Hospital in Tehran, it was almost completely destroyed by shock waves from hitting the IRIB media office across the road, and the Persian Gulf Martyrs Hospital in Bushehr was very badly damaged by shock waves from attacking some of the civilian sites around the hospital. So there's tremendous damage to the infrastructure, but it's sort of random. And because Iran is so big, and because the cities are so big, people are going about their normal business, basically. even though there are these atrocities happening dotted around these big cities, you'll be, for example, we're in the middle of Shahrbaz Palace in Isfahan, a beautiful city, virtually the cultural capital of Iran. And people are, it's a beautiful day. I remember there was a thunderstorm. The sun came out after a thunderstorm. Uh, Beautiful bazaar there with works of art and so on. And then you see a plume of smoke over in the distance, and the industrial area has been hit something or other there. Who knows what they're hitting there? Because the sites that we saw in the industrial areas of Isfahan and in Tehran, for example, they're hitting council depots, recycling trucks, all sorts of odd things, post offices, post office workers, and then the schools, school children, So it's like a type of, it's like Gaza, but it's different to Gaza in the sense that it's not, it would be wrong to say it's carpet bombing the cities because the cities are so big. They are hitting these sites, killing people. Magnetic mines dropped on villages on the outskirts of Shiraz. These are anti-tank, anti-weapon mines dropped from aeroplanes on villages. What for? What purpose? You can't really. It's very hard to determine. The a radio transmitter that a media. I thought it was air defense, but it was actually a media radio transmitter in Bandar Abbas. We saw. And then we had to leave because a drone came in after it was hit, basically. But we went to visit the family of the media worker who was killed there. And all across Iran, you have these scenes of grieving families who've lost their family members, sometimes a couple of people, sometimes could be a large number of people, as in Nilufar Square in Tehran. An 8-story block completely demolished in Bandar Abbas and the port city in the south there, So a lot of destruction, a lot of killing, but they're not really damaging the capacity of the Iranian state to fire its munitions, which are in 21st century manner are held in these underground cities, underground missile cities and drone cities, basically. So they didn't slow much the capacity of the Iranians. They found one of the exit points of one of those cities in Yazid province, and they were bombing the exit, but without destroying the missile city there, basically. So even the Iranians are still manufacturing underground their munitions there. Of course, the Chinese are helping them. They do have significant support from China. China is not directly involved in this, but in terms of logistics, in terms of intelligence, in terms of defense technology, yes, China and to some extent Russia are deeply involved in helping Iran. They don't want to see Iran fall. And of course, the Persian Gulf is very important to China in particular for its energy sources, basically. So the US is trying to open with its blockade on the Persian Gulf shipping, it's trying to open a front against the Chinese, basically, which is making it harder for them, basically. So the second thing we saw, apart from all the sites of that were being bombed, is tremendous mobilization of the people. And this is really, I don't know if it was expected, but unprecedented sort of mobilization in all of the major cities every evening in many squares. For example, in Tehran, something like 22 squares every evening, there were mobilizations of people out in support of their armed forces, in support of their government. And that includes a lot of people coming back into Iran from Europe, from Turkey, from other parts of the world to defend their country. That's an extraordinary phenomenon because usually, of course, civilians flee bombing of the country as they did in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. But in the case of Iran, there's a lot of people coming back to Iran because they want to play some role in defending their country. They want to rally around the flag. And that includes people who, of course, support the government, also people who are critical of the government. And there have been some Iranian sites, some Iranian accounts posting these on Instagram, for example. Instagram, which has a lot of censorship under its Meta company, but nevertheless, these sorts of things, and I've been reposting some of them on Twitter or X, but there is a very large mobilization of people, including expats coming back to the country. So we joined them in Tehran, we joined them in Isfahan, we joined them in Shiraz. Um, every evening, and it's still going on. You remember when Trump threatened to bomb the bridges and the power stations? There was a mobilization of people around bridges and power stations. And of course, the US in the media war was saying, oh, Iran is using these people as human shields. The people are using themselves as human shields in a way, of course, there are casualties there. The Quds rally for Palestine at the end of Ramadan in Tehran. There was a big rally out in Tehran in one of the main streets there, and a drone struck it and murdered a woman, Mariam. I've forgotten her last name, but it's become famous because they wrapped her body in a flag and then held up the flag covered in her blood. And so people are being martyred in these shows of support, but nevertheless they're ongoing. Basically, it's a tremendous rally show of patriotism, showing that people are behind their armed forces when the country's under attack. Basically, so that was made a big impression on us to see people coming out every night. And by the way, I would say the majority of people in those rallies were women, most of them women, basically coming out and flying the flag, having, of course, stages with speeches and songs and chants and so on, with the traditional, death to America and death to Israel, but lots of other patriotic chants, basically, an expression of that, which is very, very, very powerful in this context. As I said, it's a very strange war. There's no ground invasion. Here's another reason why you know that the US wasn't able to meet its objectives, whatever its objectives were in that war, that they didn't even think about a ground invasion. They didn't invade Carg Island. They were hitting Bushehr quite a lot. When we got to Bushehr, we were actually planning to go to Carg Island, but the situation was too tense at that time. It was still uncertain if they would try a ground invasion. For those of you that don't know, Carg Island is the big terminal where most of the Iran's oil, it doesn't store the oil for a long term, and they could divert to another port to export the oil, basically. But Carg Island has been serving as the off loading point for much of Iran's oil. So it was widely speculated that the Trump regime was going to attempt some sort of Iwo Jima type invasion of Carg Island. That didn't happen. Of course, no naval invasion took place either of the Straits of Hormuz. For all the talk about the Straits of Hormuz, the US warships have not dared to come close to it, have not dared to come within hundreds of kilometers of it because they fear the anti-ship missile batteries, which are all along that very mountainous coast of the north side of the Persian Gulf there. So that deterrence worked without the US even coming close, basically. And the lack of a ground invasion means that you don't have a front line as in a traditional war, basically. This is what one of the bakery owner I mentioned before at Nilofer Square said. He was involved himself in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, and he says this was a war. It's very different now. There's no front line, so you have these seemingly random attacks from the air. Clearly, they're choosing some sort of targets, but what purpose they serve is very unclear, basically. Now, the second round, what we're looking at, which could be happening today even, but certainly the speculation is this week, is that, of course, the Israelis wanted to sabotage the talks that did happen in Islamabad in Pakistan. The fact that the Trump regime called for a ceasefire and for talks showed that, as many commentators, even the smarter North American commentators, were saying, that Trump was looking for an off-ramp. He was looking for a way out. He was putting out all this misinformation about how he'd destroyed Iran and he was winning and so on. Most people looking close realized that was false, but they also recognized that Trump, I'm talking about the realist North American commentators like Mearsheimer and Douglas McGregor and others like that. He was looking for some way out, but the arrogance of the US didn't allow any advances to be made in those talks in Islamabad. And while the talks were happening, they were threatening to kill the negotiating team if they didn't get what they wanted out of that. So as Professor Morandi, was a media advisor to the team, was pointing out, basically. So you see the character of the US regime is being shown through this war too, and that's one of the reasons I think why many of the Europeans have been splitting. The president of Germany apparently was strongly criticized the war. Most of the Europeans, except for the Brits, were trying to stay out of it. Even the British were ambiguous, offering their facilities to the US, but really not supporting the war in any overt sort of sense. The French cut a deal apparently to get at least one ship through, and that's the prospect that Trump faces. That when when the IRGC, when Iran security forces seized control of the Straits of Hormuz in the middle of this conflict, and just before we reached Bandar Abbas, um, they didn't have their so-called allies on board. Neither the French nor the Germans nor the Italians nor the others were on board with the war. They didn't want to be involved. They didn't know what the pretext was meant to be. No one knew what the pretext was meant to be. And when it became reopening the Straits of Hormuz, that was the absurdity of it was not lost on most people who realized that the straits were open before the war began, basically. Now Iran has gained control of those straits in its territorial waters and is enforcing a customary law doctrine of innocent passage. They will allow innocent passage. But as neither Iran nor the US are parties to the UN law of the sea, the strict international rights under that are not subject to Iran is not subject to them. Basically, the main passage is between two of the three islands just off Bandar Abbas, which are clearly in Iran's territorial waters under customary law, and it can enforce innocent passage or non-innocent passage, and that's exactly what it said it was doing from the beginning. I was reading Iranian reports. We got to Bandar Abbas. We met the governor of Hormuzgan province, and we were traveling with a specialist journalist in the energy sector in Iran. And from those interviews, I gathered what you probably all know now, basically, that Iran has said that we are enforcing a security clearance on these straits because of the war. And we will authorize and sometimes charge a toll on cargo going through those straits there. When we went out into the straits, from Bandar Abbas after visiting the girls' school and the cemetery at Minab. We were going to go to Hormuz Island, but the night before, the US or the Israelis or both had bombed the port at Hormuz Island, and so for security reasons, we didn't go there. We went out into the straits, and you may have seen some video of us there, just commenting on the ships sitting offshore, which were mainly Iranian ships because they felt safer sitting out offshore than sitting in the ports because they feared that the ports, at Bandar Abbas or wherever it was, were going to be hit by the drones. And we didn't see any drones when we were there, but a drone came and bombed the girls' school after we'd been there for some reason, for some unknown reason, basically. So there was always a danger of strikes on some of the sites we were visiting there. There was a bit of a security scare we had there at that time, but the passage of shipping kept going, as you may know. China shipping kept going, Iraq's shipping kept going. Basically, those with a good relationship with Iran and the BRICS nations kept going through the straits. Some of the ships of the family monarchies of the Persian Gulf, which had US bases, were getting ships through after a security clearance and after they had paid a toll. Basically, they were the people being subject to a toll. I don't know whether the Chinese were subject to a toll. Probably not, because they were buying Iranian fuel anyway. So they didn't really need to charge a toll on top of that, basically. But it was the security clearance they were enforcing. And Iran is not letting this go now, basically. All that the Trump regime has done is to impose another blockade outside the straits, much further south, into the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Sea, basically there. And they have captured one Iranian flag container ship. But that's the brilliant strategy of the US. They will pose a blockade on the blockade, basically, and then pretend that they've opened the straits in some way. Of course, what they will be doing is attracting more ire to Washington for what it has done to global energy supplies. As you know, 20% of the world's global energy supplies have traditionally passed through the Straits of Hormuz, but that's mainly going to Europe and Asia. And most of the Asians already cut a deal with Tehran, basically, to get their ships through before this additional blockade by the Trump regime. So the Europeans, at least France, had some deal with Tehran. It would be open to all of the other Europeans to cut deals, but then they have to deal with the US blockade there, basically. So Iran is not letting go in that. the US has shown it's not capable of seizing control of the straits. It's not capable of invading even any of the littoral islands there. They spoke about invading Karg Island and another one, Abu Musa Island, but they haven't done it yet. And the Iranians say, come on, we're waiting for you. We've been preparing for this for over 20 years. So the fact that they've established this type of deterrence and this type of control is another sign of how clearly in front they came out of the first round of the war there. Of course, there are many thousands of people who were killed and injured by this bombing, but it hasn't really made a significant dent in the capacity of the nation to defend itself. And that's why I say at this stage, Iran is winning now. There, there is the prospect we are facing now, and including like imminently, that a second round of this war will start happening, and then that's going to be a terrible thing for the region. The Iranians have promised, again, um, people perhaps they didn't, perhaps no one anticipated the powerful tool that control of the Straits of Hormuz would be. But the Iranians had promised that they were going to retaliate against the US bases in the Persian Gulf, and they did. And we know now that 17 bases have been totally destroyed or partly destroyed. None of them are operational, basically. So one of the objectives of the Iranians in this war, and you see it, you remember the US had 15 points and the Iranians had 10 points, was the complete expulsion of US forces from the Persian Gulf. And of course, the Persian Gulf monarchies have been whinging and saying, "Oh, why were we struck?" Really, well, they were hitting the bases. The UAE is the most deeply embedded with the Israelis and with the US. They have at least two US air bases, one naval base, and one Australian air base, actually, which people may not have been aware. Why would Australia have a naval base in the UAE? Well, it came after the invasion of Iraq and after Australia's shameful collaboration in that invasion of Iraq more than 20 years ago. And now Australia has set itself up as an ally of the Israelis and the US in this aggression. So they're getting what they deserve basically in their base in the UAE. Also, of course, the Iranians were chasing US service people into the hotels of Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain. Bahrain, their big naval base, after the bases had been destroyed. So there's a question for those Gulf monarchies whose existence depends on their oil industry, basically, is if they're ever going to let the US come back in and rebuild those military bases which are aimed at Iran. And of course, Iran doesn't want to permit it. The Gulf monarchies have to reconsider their position. At the moment, the Iranians have succeeded. There's no really seriously functioning base there. There is some firing of missiles still going on from that side of things, particularly from the Emirates. Most of the civilian infrastructure has not been damaged in the Emirates as yet, but there's a great risk of that because the oil facilities have not been destroyed yet. If the Trump regime proceeds with attacks on the oil and other civilian infrastructure in Iran, the Iranians are going to respond in kind. There is an escalation ladder there when we haven't gone a long way up it yet, despite appearances to the contrary. But the Iranians have promised a proportional escalation on that ladder once the US starts hitting its oil infrastructure and other civilian infrastructure. Of course, the Gulf monarchies on the south side of the Persian Gulf are far more vulnerable when it comes to things like desalination plants. Iran is not vulnerable to those types of strikes in the same way. It's much only to a very small extent dependent on desalination. But Bahrain and Kuwait, and most of these monarchies, by the way, barely existed as civilizations before. Bahrain did. Bahrain and Kuwait did. Dubai was a fishing village back in the 70s. So they're very artificial constructs and they can be destroyed very easily. They're very vulnerable. And of course, one thing that the war has proven is that the presence of US bases was no protection for any of these regimes, basically, not even the Saudis, basically. And of course, the other prospect that hasn't opened yet is the other side of the Arabian Peninsula and the Bab al-Mandab Strait in the Red Sea. The Ansar Allah revolutionary government, wrongly called Houthi rebels, they haven't been rebels for a decade. They've been running a revolutionary government there. Rebel groups usually don't make hypersonic missiles Um, so the Yemeni revolutionary government has promised to enter against the Saudis when necessary, and of course they're already back to their blockade on the Israelis. But if the Saudis want to export oil on the west side and fertilizer, which is not a big factor, apparently one-third of the world's fertilizer from the petrochemical industry comes from or came from the Persian Gulf and could be redirected to the Red Sea, but that's going to be um, the Red Sea is also subject to an embargo or a blockade by the resistance forces there, basically. So the impact on the global economy has not yet really seriously begun. You've seen some raising of prices, but it hasn't really reached the level it could have. And if it's going to impact fertilizer, it's going to impact food supply. And of course, transport is linked to food supply too. So fortunately, little Cuba has had that blockade broken with thanks to Russian ship of oil, which reached Cuba a week or so ago. So there's some relief going on there now. I think Trump claimed he gave permission to the Russian ship to arrive, and the Russians said they hadn't even spoken to the US about their ship going to Cuba, basically. So there's a huge amount of misinformation coming out. It's become part of the war. Be very careful about this misinformation. When it comes to Iran, go to the foreign ministry's offices and to Mr. Kalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, who's leading the negotiating team, and to Professor Marandi, you'll get more accurate information there because the White House seems to be issuing misinformation virtually every day because Trump is seriously clinically demented, and that combined with his narcissism and so on has meant that really there's um, every headline in the Australian state media starts Trump says this, Trump says that. Really, if you wake up listening to that sort of thing, you're going to be very seriously misinformed. I'm not saying don't listen to the enemy media. I'm just saying be very careful with it. There is a massive amount of misinformation going on at the moment. And when it comes to Iran, really, there's no reason why you shouldn't just go to some of the official Iranian sources. Um, the some of the Iranian media is blocked on Western servers these days. The Iranian media itself, there's been two levels of SIM cards there. We had access to so-called white SIM cards there, which have very little restriction on them within Iran. The average people don't have that because they have blocked the mobilization of counter-revolutionary forces within Iran through the SIM card. So people, in other words, ordinary people have access to a restricted internet and one which allows them to communicate within Iran. The white SIM cards, which media people and others have, mean that the Iranian media is reporting in a much more unrestricted way through its Telegram channels. If you go to the Telegram channels of some of the key Iranian media like Tasnim and Mer, um, Telegram will automatically translate the Persian into English for you. You can read their official sites. Anyway, the officials and I said people like Marandi are posting in English on Twitter, on X, so you can find direct Iranian posts there. But be very careful. I see even some critical sites. There's a Pakistani site which is usually quite good, but they're posting. Washington says that if Iran agrees to this, but then they're posting up proposals coming from Washington. So you have to be very careful about what's been agreed. The US is trying to pretend for tactical reasons that Iran has agreed to A, B, C, D, E when no such thing has happened. And then, according to Morandi and some other commentators, probably apart from being Trump madness, there's probably a strategy or a tactic which says that they can claim down that Trump will claim down the track that Iran has reneged on its agreement to do ABC, basically. So this is the danger of these false reports about agreements that have been made. Iran has not made agreements. So far as I know, until today, they have not agreed to go back to Islamabad, basically, because they wanted some concrete preconditions for talks. They're not going to be happy with something signed on a piece of paper. Of course, there's no trust in the Washington administrators there. When JD Vance was in Islamabad last time, he was on the phone to Trump. He wasn't pre-authorized to make agreements. He was on the phone to Trump, and apparently Netanyahu was in the loop there too. So, there wasn't really an authorized force there. Having two real estate agents with him didn't help, of course, the Kushner and what's the other one's name, Witkoff. But whereas the Khalibaf and the others were authorized by the leader, by the Iranian leader, they didn't have to speak to Tehran. They were authorized to make an agreement, but they had no basis for an agreement by the time the first talks failed, basically. And so far as I know, they're not back in Islamabad, and the so-called deadlines of the ceasefire are, which came to include Lebanon in the end. It seems that the Trump regime did manage to put some pressure on Netanyahu to stop the terrible bombardment that was going on of Lebanon at that time, even though Netanyahu didn't want to be part of these talks and wanted to sabotage the talks. Of course, the Iranians were testing whether Trump could actually hold in or put a leash on his rabid dog, as they put it, basically. And it seems that at least temporarily he could. So there was some relief in the bombardment of Lebanon, but we'll see how far that goes because clearly the Israeli leadership, and not just Netanyahu, but the others, are very much against the idea of a any sort of New Deal, basically. Whereas to the Trump regime, they are still, in many respects, I believe, looking for an off-ramp, looking for a way out where they can claim some fake victory and escape this because things can get much worse for Trump, particularly if he tries a naval or a ground invasion, which been hasn't been tried yet. There's still more bombing they can do from the air, but it's speculated there may be a first attempt at a naval or a ground invasion, and that will be very costly for the US. Of course, they've covered up their losses so far. You know that. We know some outside analysts. There's one Indian retired air marshal who says, well, they lost at least 44 warplanes and helicopters, at least 44. How are you not going to have casualties if you lose 44 aircraft? They haven't announced the casualties of that at all. You know, the operation in Isfahan, which they claimed was to rescue a pilot. The better understanding of that is that it was an operation to try and infiltrate with a specialist weapons person to infiltrate one of the nuclear facilities and come out with a trophy for Trump. He is desperate for some sort of trophy to say, look, we've got this so many kilograms of enriched uranium, and therefore, we've obliterated their program for the third time or whatever it is he's trying to say. But he wants something to hang on to hang his hat onto and say, this is how we've won, how we've destroyed Iran. He's been saying it, but he hasn't got something to show for it. So he is still looking for something to show for it, I think, because even as demented and narcissistic as he is, it can't be beyond his scope to understand that the US haven't been able to seriously destroy the Iranian state or the Iranian nation, and they've been taking a hammering basically. And of course, their major one of the most expensive aircraft carrier retreated. The other one is another one, the George H.W. Bush, is coming around Africa, not coming through the Red Sea. Notice they're going the long way around Africa to come into the sphere to give them more capacity to launch warplanes, which have to be refueled. And the Iranians have been destroying some of those refueling planes, as they did in Isfahan, the C-130s, and they destroyed at least some on the ground in Saudi Arabia too. So the US has been taking a battering. They've been covering up the casualties. Imagine if the 44 warplanes had no casualties. What about the 17 US military bases in the Persian Gulf? No casualties again. This has been concealed by the US so far. So anyway, we can move into discussion perhaps from that. If you want to ask more about what we saw in Iran, I'm happy with that. I have to say, though, that the Australian state media found out I was in Iran when I was there and sent me because they saw some video on Iranian media of us in the Straits of Hormuz. And then what they did was the same as what the Murdoch media did when I was in Syria many years ago. They said, instead of asking me anything about what I saw, you would imagine if you see a compatriot in a country at war, you'd say, what are you observing there? They didn't ask anything about what I was observing. They said, we saw you in an Iranian state propaganda video. Are you being paid? And I said, okay, well, you're not a real journalist. You just want to do a smear story. Go away, basically. So that it's extraordinary the level to which the Western media, more generally, I would say, but all of the Australian media, I would say, except for uh, some of those on the edges and some of the social media like Consortium News and so on, were incapable of even speaking to a witness from a war zone because they were so desperate to maintain the official story, basically. This is extraordinary. Even I would add to that, what's going on now is something I saw in Syria was that even when the US officials had admitted certain things, such as that they were supporting the ISIS and Al Qaeda groups in Syria, the Western media kept reporting that they were in Syria to fight ISIS and the Al Qaeda groups, basically. So, in other words, the Western media would go above and beyond what their own government officials were admitting at the moment. And I think we're seeing that again in Iran, really, that the official line is out there. There's a very loyal, embedded, what I call a colonial media. They maintain the line come what may, and really they're quite impervious to any sort of independent observations or evidence. Okay, I'll open it up for you guys. You might want to say some things.
Thank you
What
very
what
much,
what are you
Tim.
what are you what are you seeing from your position there? I'm curious too.
Well, from our position, it's hard to distinguish. Like you said, there's so much misinformation that really the simplest way to cut all of that out is, as you say, get the information from your reliable sources in Iran. And, just having made contact with Morandi as well, and seeing the integrity of the man makes, it's very easy. He's our go-to source that we often share, on a daily basis. I mean, the man hasn't stopped, as I'm sure you know. You can see that too, Tim. He's round the clock reporting with every media outlet. I think that's why our job, and that's why we invited you here, Tim, is because there is so much nonsense out there. And even it's sad to see, and sad to actually have to say this, some sources that would claim to be, pro-resistance all along, and anti-genocide, and very much staunchly pro-resistance for Palestine, creating confusion as well with the mixed messages,
Yeah.
and you know that's not good. So our job, like I was going to ask you the question, but as I was thinking of asking you the question, what do we need to do? And I'd often ask Barry that as well. But I think the immediate thing we need to do, and we're doing it tonight and every week, is to counter mainstream media and to have that independent revolutionary channel. I know this is, just a YouTube is going to be on YouTube or whatever, but it creates knowledge and it creates awareness, and for everyone who hears the truth, from the like of you, Tim, and the truth tellers, they're then able and empowered to counter the nonsense narratives, not just of Trump's ridiculous tweets, but of, and not just BBC or the Guardian or that's what I'm saying. It is sad to see some journalists that we did rely on in the past, a couple of years ago, go down a different route, which is a bit defeatist, actually. But clearly you can see, look, you could talk at length there. You cannot deny the fact that Iran is winning. Um, the fact that, they have this desire simply to survive, and that doesn't matter. I mean, the desire to survive and that dedication to one's country, and even the mentality of saying those who die is, well, these people are martyrs. That mentality alone is just so
Yeah.
probably alien to the Western mindset, which shows you how colonized actually our brains are. Listen, I don't want to take up an awful lot of time, and it's also late. So maybe I was looking for Morgan earlier because I know, Morgan, you give us regular updates. Can you hear us, Morgan? You might have a comment or question for Tim.
Well, hi Tim. It's good to see you back again. So yeah, I did obviously follow your journey when you went to the region recently. I thought it was quite interesting, um, and it's good to be able to get an insight regularly as events arise from the likes of yourself and obviously Professor Morandi, as Roisin mentioned, especially because we're very limited in what we're permitted to hear in Europe. You meant, I think yourself or Roisin mentioned, that it's important to follow Iranian media, but it's also very difficult to find Iranian media. And for that reason, it's particularly trustworthy figures like yourselves and maybe if you were able to kind of curate your Twitter or your Telegram channels, these are the kind of best options, because the news that people are kind of hearing about events in Iran at the moment, in particular in Ireland, you referenced the accusations that the Iranian state were directing civilians to form human shields around critical infrastructure, for example. So even some of the commentary online was that I noticed was from people who were appalled on the face of it by what the Americans did in the first hours of the war, in particular. But they still carried this propaganda that, oh my God, it's clearly a reactionary state that's on its last legs, that it's got this massive population of 90 million people at the end of a barrel of a gun, that they're able to command them to do this. But it was quite the opposite. Obviously, the slightest bit of interrogation of this kind of propaganda and it kind of falls apart. But people aren't really conditioned to interrogate it, I guess, especially if perhaps they're kind of just used to watching the news, and they perhaps found it trustworthy throughout their lives. As well as that, it's probably the same in Australia, but I'd be keen to get your insight into what Australian media is like, and just whether it is just as bad as the European and Irish media. Because and I'll leave you with one more reference as well, that this constant barrage of images of young, good-looking, college-aged people in Iran who are being condemned to death at the moment, and it's always one of either two options. So if you interrogate it slightly and you look for particular sources from Iran, either on Telegram or on Twitter in particular, then you find that there's indisputable video evidence of these people either committing heinous crimes or these people just don't exist at all. But it's been carried in particular not by the I suppose the state media here, but that would be more so from anti-Iran or American-aligned independent commentators, supposedly
Amnesty International.
And Amnesty International.
Yeah.
Oh my, yes. So I mean, this is kind of. I feel like if you have any idea of how the world works, then you only believe these kind of stories if you want to believe them. But there are actually genuinely quite a large number of people here who find it safer, perhaps, and so that they've just conditioned themselves to carry this propaganda against these states that are the targets of the Americans and the Israelis. So I understand that a lot of the news as it relates to geopolitics in Australia is also dreadful, but I'm not familiar with much of in particular when it comes to China now and another kind of geopolitical foes of America. But is it just as bad as the European media? Is it just as aligned with the America's interests as the European media when it comes to Iran? And what are some of the highlights that you found over the last month?
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. Look, I think it's worse probably, because of course the Anglo-Americans are the ones that are really still dominating the world of media and propaganda, basically. Finance and media and propaganda. They've lost it with technology, they're losing it with production and commerce, but in media they're up there basically. And the only significance of Australia as a little outlier in the Anglo-American world is basically this, that we do have that same recycling of propaganda methods. And we have a Labor government here, which is appalling, just like overtly collaborating with the Israelis and with now with this war against Iran too. Basically, I think even the British state is trying to pretend that it's a little bit arm's length there, even though they're offering Diego Garcia and some other facilities to the North Americans, basically. So the media falls into line with that here. Not that I'm a serious student of it. I try and avoid it as much as I can, but I do actually scan once a day the state media headlines of the ABC to see and occasionally I post about it really because of some of the extraordinary antics they get up to. But they do, virtually every lead story in the Australian state media begins, Trump says something, something, and Trump says something, something. So that tells you how facile a tool it's become to promote what the White House has been pumping out, basically. If the emperor says something, far from saying the emperor has no clothes, they're really reinforcing that message. And then they'll be doing some sort of, they have a sort of dissidence which they borrow from the Europeans, really. They're very derivative in a way. I remember back when I was, studying in the 70s, that it was said that the Australian media was more monopolized than any except the Canadians, basically, who were closer to the US. So um, when the Australian state, which really tells you, that the Australian oligarchy, which runs the media, is running the Australian state too, of course. But when they are embarrassed at not wanting to be, completely seen as in the pocket of whatever creature is in charge in Washington, they will look to the Brits and they will look to France or they will look to some other European to, for example, to recognize the state of Palestine, that sort of empty symbolism that was there, to revert to this old two-state solution idea and then pretend, therefore, they're at arm's length from the Trump regime. Because, of course, no one really likes Trump, but they're all afraid of him, basically. They're afraid of whoever's in the White House, and they're afraid of the retribution that he can do economically and politically, basically. So the Australian media is appalling, just really, really appalling. And the state media, which was a little bit critical of the invasion of Iraq, got disciplined over that. They had a special inquiry to bring it to heel after, 2005, whenever it was, basically. And in fact, they even funded, the Australian state funded a US study centre at the university I used to work at, the University of Sydney, to try, can you believe it, to try and promote closer cultural ties with the US, even though we all grew up with Donald Duck and one thing and another. But nevertheless, they wanted to embed it in academia. And I think I may have said this to you before in a previous session, that it is virtually banned to talk about Gaza in any university in Australia now, basically. That's the extent of the censorship there. And of course, I think actually Britain may be slightly worse when it comes to arresting people for supporting the Palestinian resistance. I think it seems to me that your neighbour there has the worst laws in the English-speaking world when it comes to repressing speech about Palestine. But Australia's not too far behind. One of the states banned from the river to the sea the expression. And then there's a popular song 10 or 20 years ago by an Australian singer, Johnny Farnham, which is not to do with Palestine, but from the river to the sea. So people have started singing that. So people are finding their way around these absurd new contrived censorship mechanisms, basically. Some young woman was arrested for her T-shirt and so on. You may recall, there was an Iranian women's football team in Australia some before the outbreak of the latest round of war, and the Australian government tried a publicity stunt to offer them political asylum in Australia, and that was effectively giving them, a residence visa without going through the normal process of getting into the queue and so on, which they had carried on because Australia is an in-demand place for immigration, basically. But so anyway, while that was going on, these poor young women who just come to play football basically had their bus rammed by some Iranian monarchists. And the bus was rammed when they were under a police escort. They were coerced by the federal police. Most of them bailed out and decided to go home. And they saw young women being arrested for wearing T-shirts in support of Palestine. They really got the serious PR treatment in Australia. And when they got home, they went on the Iranian media saying, "Thank God we're out of that place," basically. So it was a PR stunt that backfired very badly. But all of the media, including the commercial media and the state media, they were talking about these journalists. I saw one of them down the road in the supermarket actually saying we should take their phones away from them so they can't be subject to Iranian propaganda when they're in Australia. It was extraordinary the extent to which the journalists participated in, proactively in this sort of attempt to try and basically kidnap, take hostages these young women, because this was the big campaign was the freedom, women, life, freedom, the freedom of women in Iran was one of the background sort of cause célèbre for the war, basically, and extraordinary the lengths that people would go to try and maintain this fiction. Well, fortunately, the Iranians themselves have been doing some pretty good social media. You've probably seen Explosive Media and their Lego films. Apparently, there's several creators who are doing Lego-styled films. They're not just Explosive Media, but I like the fact that there's a film director um, on Instagram who posts a lot of people at these protests. We saw them at the rallies. The patriotic rallies basically, and you see from that a lot of women, dressed in different ways because it's still in Western mind that somehow or other there's some regimentation of dress of women in Iran, even though that's really been gone for a long time. I think I mentioned this before, that young women particularly, subverted that a very long time ago. And then along came the US State Department and tried to turn it into a regime change program, basically, cynically. They didn't care about it because the MEK terrorists, which they fund, are far more regimented in the way that they dress. The executions you're talking about, yeah, that's has two roots really. One of them was the MEK mercenaries who are now based in Albania. They were part of the left in Iran, which was part of the revolution. They killed some North Americans back in the day. That's why they got proscribed. This is the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, or there's another name for them, the MOK, the MEK. They were then contracted by Saddam Hussein to fight on the Iraqi side against Iran. And that's why that generation in Iran hates them, because they killed a lot of Iranians. Then their leaders got sent to Paris, and now they're in Albania, largely funded by the Saudis. And it was Obama that took them off the US terrorist list in 2012, because Obama wanted to use them in some way against Iran. But it was actually Trump in his first term and his second term, which is using them more for assassinations. They were involved in that campaign to assassinate nuclear scientists and so on. So there was a wave of those people arrested, and they were being executed. And I think the former President Raisi was a Chief Justice at the time when they were being sentenced to death. And they mounted a big propaganda campaign against Raisi for that reason. He was Dr. Death or whatever. Now, the more recent ones you've referred to, I think that comes from January, the attacks of January the 8th and the 9th, where 3,117 people were killed. The Iranian government has actually named them all and identified them all, as opposed to just throwing numbers around. 3,117, I think it was. 200 of them police, 100 of them Basij, who were helping state officials. They were volunteer groups, basically. And then a lot of civilians who were, shot in the head, basically, at this attempt to hijack the genuine protests over the collapse of the currency in December last year and the economic conditions. So some of those people who were videotaped on CCTV killing police officers, for example, I know there was 3 young men who were athletes. One of them, at least, was a champion wrestler. They'd killed 2 police officers with machetes. And the campaign that was backed by Amnesty International and others, which put up that these young men were being executed, didn't say what they were charged or convicted of at all, including Amnesty. Amnesty is quite dishonest in this. They put up these campaigns and they say, join this campaign to save so-and-so from being executed, without saying anything, like nothing about what they were charged or convicted of. Or they would put in that they were convicted of crimes against God or something like that, which is one type of subversionary type of coverall charge, which is linked to actual crimes, basically, but they won't mention the actual crimes. So, of course, that stuff gets widespread traction when it has the credibility of Amnesty International. Unfortunately, of course, Amnesty has a very long track record of being involved in these color revolutions and other campaigns. You may recall, if you're old enough, the first Gulf War, when there was a UN force sent in to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And there was that nurse Nayira, who was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, it turned out. But she had the story about babies being thrown out of incubators onto the floors and so on. Amnesty bought into that one. Amnesty bought into the Gaddafi story about the troops being given Viagra to rape women and so on. So Amnesty's got a long history of they bought into a lot of the Syrian stories too. So they've got a long history of collaborating in these pretexts for war. Unfortunately, because they still have credibility with a lot of lefty liberal people in Western countries, basically. But yes, as you said, you've got to look a little bit carefully at these sorts of things. Now, in terms of media, yeah, there is a problem in accessing some of the media because the US will block some things, and really, I'm having trouble with a lot of the Iranian media on normal browsers in Australia. But the way to read them is really through their Telegram channels, which, as I said, Telegram does a good job of, not that there's no restrictions on Telegram, but it's less censored than most of the other social media. And most of the Iranian media and social media, including, by the way, the IRGC, which is SEPA, SEPAH, the IRGC, Tasnim News, TASNIM. Even if you search it there, it will find it. It will be listed as a Persian channel in Persian, but if you turn on the translation, and Telegram will translate. Press TV, which is in English, on Telegram. Tasnim in Persian, but will be translated into English. The IRGC, SEPA, SEPAH, so the official military channel, they will tell you, exactly who's being allowed through the Straits of Hormuz and who is not, basically. Their Persian channel will be translated into English for you. So, yeah, that's I recommend that. In terms of up-to-date news about has there been an agreement with, of course, the foreign minister Abbas Araghchi, he's posting quite a lot. So if there's been an agreement with Iran, look for the Iranian side and not for the White House. I see Alan has a hand up there to say something.
I suppose just before we let go of those that were being, I suppose, condemned to death as well, it's probably worth noting before wrapping up on that there was an agreement reached where anyone who was being prosecuted for the crimes of the 8th and the 9th of January were actually given not a reprieve, but they were being held in prison even post-trial on the provision that they wouldn't have the sentences carried out if the Americans and the Israelis didn't attack. So when the Israelis and the Americans attacked at the end of February, it effectively signed the death warrants of those that were involved in the foremost rioting of those nights. So that just shows exactly how much the Americans and the Israelis care about their effective agents in the country, that they did effectively confirm their death sentences.
Well, they bombed last year, the 12-day war, they bombed Erevan prison too, for the objective of which is not clear to me, basically. So they obviously don't care about their agents. And the people on the 8th and 9th of January, it's true that they were linked, and the Iranian intelligence has a lot of information on how they were working with Mossad and with the CIA, which advertised it publicly. The Israeli media was advertising it, basically. But when they shut down the internet and saw the what's it called? The satellite internet, the Elon Musk satellite internet.
Starlink.
When they saw Starlink still working, as indeed it was working in Ukraine, by the way, Ukraine was using it to target Russian targets, and so the Russians took it out in the Donbass. But when they saw who had the Starlink there, then they were able to hone in on the organizers of the ground operations back in June last year. I imagine they did something similar in January. Yeah.
Thank you, Morgan, for that question and back and forth. And Tim, thanks for responding. Alan, would you like to go?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to say, but just the way one of the ways I understand this is that these two wars, the Palestine and this Iran war, have created a crack in the whole illusion that the American Western governments have created about the world, which is a divided world, a racist world, a world where they are superior. Places like Iran, but they really mean the rest of the world, the non-white English speaking world are inferior. And I think this we have a big, long uphill war, ideological war to wage amongst our own people against all this, to reverse things, to transform things back to a reality, a normality, a non-racist world that they have managed to create, and which is subliminal. It's I mean, it's widespread in our societies that people think Iranian, for instance, they believe the years of anti-Iranian propaganda that there's something dishonest, subhuman, suspicious, and corrupt. We have to change that. We have to create a balance which is honest, and in a way, the stupid mistakes that they make, which they have to make at some points, the way they are, expose an opportunity for this to happen, to bring about their end, a much better future for society and for the world. Oh, and I suppose one of the things I would like to know more about is what on earth is, how much influence does the Mossad have in Iran? Sometimes we're told that they're everywhere, that's how they have this information. Is this true? Is the society rotten with Israeli spies, or is that just exaggerated? Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah, on that last point, look, Iranian society is quite an open society in many ways, So there have been a lot of refugees there from Afghanistan and people from other countries passing through. There's huge pilgrimages. Once a few years ago, I went to Mashhad, to one of the pilgrimages there at a time of the Trump's maximum pressure sanctions. I couldn't find a hotel room in Mashhad, a city of 5 million people. There were so many people going there for the pilgrimages. There's a huge traffic through Iran. So the Mossad has been able to recruit Afghans, for example. At one stage, there was something like 3 million Afghans. There's some sort of staged agreement to send some of those people back to Afghanistan, but the relations with the Taliban have been a little bit dicey, and the Taliban say they haven't got the capacity to take so many people at once and so on. So there's a lot of transient people in Iran, and there's a lot of people who were able to be compromised, basically. So the Mossad did have a lot of people in Iran, and they had a lot of people for that operation on the 8th and 9th of January, just recently, basically. But the tactic of taking down Starlink, identifying the Starlink terminals, which were all unauthorized, basically. So you knew that people had got them through unauthorized means, basically. They rounded up a lot of people in January. I think the ones that they were sentencing to death were mainly the ones they had compromised with particular murders, basically. But intelligence did round up a lot of people in January, which made it more difficult for the Ramadan war. If we put them in phases like that, June last year there was the January operation, and then the Ramadan war, which of course went beyond Ramadan and may restart after Ramadan. Now, the Mossad lost a lot of operatives on the ground at that time, so they didn't have the capacity to make some sort of insurrection when the next wave of attacks happened. That's what they'd hoped, I suppose. I think that's partly also what the Israelis sold to Trump. Some of the US commentators are saying, it sounds right to me, that Trump is probably feeling misled by his Israeli, I don't know what you call them, allies or masters or whatever, because they told him it was going to be a piece of cake. Trump obviously wanted a very fast victory, like the Venezuelan one, in and out, and you achieve your objectives, basically. I'm not even sure exactly if it was that clear in Venezuela yet, but I'm still investigating. But certainly he wanted a very clear victory in a few days. And of course, all the propaganda was, this is a hated regime in Iran. It's a house of cards. It's going to fall over if you decapitate it, literally murder the leadership. Then once the dictators are gone, then the people will rise up against it. And of course, the problem is they believe their own propaganda. They believe their own bullshit. And that was probably part of the miscalculation of the Trump regime, even though many people within the military had warned him against this war. It seems pretty clear. There's a lot of dissidents in the military, and I think you would have seen relatively recently during the Ramadan War that the so-called Minister for War, sacked a lot of the senior generals who weren't on board with everything that wanted to be done there. I think if I were in the military there, I'd be very upset about the idea of being sent into a ground operation too, because they've known for a long time that that was going to be disastrous. Basically, they would corral them and then pick them off with artillery, let alone drones and missiles. So the propaganda effect on Trump must have been important, and that the idea that there wasn't great depth of popular support for the state was something that the Washington didn't properly understand, basically, and that expected a collapse, and that depended on them having some sort of ground assets there, which a lot of which were rounded up in January, basically. So I think that's part of the dilemma that Washington's trying to escape. Can it bomb its way out of this miscalculation? I doubt it. I doubt it. It's clearly going to make things much worse for the global economy. And if the blockade tightens on the Red Sea as well, then that's really going to tighten the screws substantially on the price of fuel and the price of food. I mean, this is the danger of it, really. That and I think that most of the North Americans analysts understand this, that it's going to have a big, widespread impact. Never mind that the U.S. has in recent times has been relatively self-sufficient, but on the edge of being self-sufficient in fuel. But it can't cover up the gap that's going to be exposed by a blockade on Hormuz, which now the US is clearly primarily responsible for. They'll try and blame Iran, but everyone will see that it is the US that's refusing to allow, if they're refusing to allow Chinese ships out. I'm not sure what's going to happen there too. The Chinese did get some ships through the beginnings of that blockade. I'm not sure what stomach the US has for trying to confront Chinese ships there and have a confrontation with the Chinese ships, but certainly Trump is in a very difficult situation when it comes to trying to cover that up. And given that his assets on the ground have disappeared, basically, and you see, in fact, recently I posted one very powerful testimony from a relatively young woman who was there at the rallies and saying, listen, I don't want the negotiating team to compromise on the principles that so many people have died for. Now you have this impact in Iran, and they remember the Zarifs and the Rouhanis in Iran who did the JCPOA in 2015, and that was a big article of faith on the reformist liberal side of politics in Iran. And the current president is of that persuasion, but I believe, according to what Morandi says at least, that he's much more a centrist. He's moved to the center, and of course the people rallying behind the flag has helped the political resolve, the political will of the current government but there's a fear in the background people have that there's this faction in Iranian politics is going to sell us out in some way. People have died for these principles, and are the negotiators going to give these sorts of things up? And probably they're influenced also by the US propaganda. They'll see this stuff coming from Washington saying, oh, the Iranians have agreed to surrender all of the uranium and do this and do that, even though they're just proposals that haven't been agreed to. But there's a fear there because they fear that this deal that was done in 2015 was a very treacherous type of deal in a way, and they see the young men who've died now in recent weeks and months to defend Iran as a sovereign state, and they don't want to surrender the nuclear program. They don't want to surrender their support for Lebanon, for Palestine. They don't want to surrender the great deterrent force they've built up over decades in missiles and drones and so on, because some politician thinks that there might be some economic relief there. So there's a rallying behind, not just behind the flag, but behind the principles that people have been dying for in Iran, and that's a very powerful new force there, and I think it will change the internal composition of politics there. There was when the President Pezeshkian was elected relatively recently, his two principalist opponents in Iran, they call them principalists, not hardliners, and these principalists are um, different to conservatives in the West because while they may be socially conservative, and this is people like Khalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, who was the main authorized official at the Islamabad talks, and Jalili, the other one, they are linked to a group in Iranian politics which does things that we would consider very non-liberal, like city planning and subsidies for poor people. In other words, it's the liberals who are more neoliberal in economic terms, and the principalists are those who will keep social security going through subsidies and interventionists in the economy, as we might say. So it doesn't exactly translate into conservatives and liberals in Western speak, basically. But I think their hand and Khalibaf is the man he's a pilot who flew his own plane into Beirut when Beirut was being bombed, so he has a bit of profile for someone who has some personal courage as well as someone who's been involved in these. But it's not a coincidence that President Pezeshkian has appointed one of his political opponents as the lead negotiator and given him, through both the president and through the supreme leader, Khamenei, Mojtaba Khamenei, to Khalibaf, to a principalist, to make the decisions at if there's going to be some sort of deal with the North Americans in Islamabad. But so far as I know now, the Iranians are not participating in a second round. It may be that they go, but they'll be looking for something more concrete from the US, not signatures on a piece of paper, because clearly they've said it very openly, and they said it to JD Vance's face. They don't trust the US. What the US is going to agree to today, they will say something. Trump will say something tomorrow. In terms of getting the US out of the Persian Gulf, the US is already out. The bases are non-functional in the Persian, from Kuwait down to Saudi Arabia. Those military bases are non-functional. The question is whether they're going to reopen or not, and that has implications for the future of those monarchies, basically. But there is this, as I say, this transformation, I think, in the political base that supports the Iranian military at home, and absolutely essential to, just as the political support for Hezbollah in Lebanon is absolutely essential for Hezbollah's work there, basically. And someone was saying it recently, it may have been Marandi, that popular support for Hezbollah is reconsolidating. The Israelis have been trying to incite another civil war in Lebanon. Iran has been trying to make sure that Lebanon is included in any deal they're doing with the US, if there is to be a deal. And the Lebanese government, treacherous as it is, has been running away, saying we're going to have separate talks with the Israelis with no leverage whatsoever. They have, the current government, as weak as it is, with a military that has never confronted the Israeli invasions, never. It's only been the resistance, and by the resistance in Lebanon we mean a Hezbollah-led coalition. Because remember, in Lebanon, the resistance is led by Hezbollah, but it includes every Palestinian faction that is in Lebanon, and it includes Amal, the other Shia political group, their militia, and it includes even the Muslim Brotherhood groups, which have been treacherous in the past and linked to Qatar, but they also have Qatari money there. So, in other words, the standing of the resistance in Lebanon and Hezbollah is rising now, despite the attempts by the US and the Israelis to get the Lebanese government to do the dirty work that the Israelis could not. In other words, disarm Hezbollah. The Israelis couldn't do it, so that they think if they divide Lebanese society, get the government to disarm Hezbollah on some principle that the state has to have a monopoly over weapons. Well, no, for 45 years, Lebanon has lived on the principle that the resistance will cooperate with the Lebanese army. And if you try and get the Lebanese army to move against Hezbollah, there will be a mutiny in the army itself. So anyway, just to say that the standing of the IRGC has risen amongst the public against liberal reformists in Iran, in a similar way that the political standing of Hezbollah is rising now, as they see that the only force really opposing the latest Israeli invasion is the traditional resistance groups that have always made those sacrifices, and they've done a lot of damage to the Israelis in South Lebanon recently. Even though it seems that Netanyahu and co are happy to sacrifice the young Israeli men in this greedy attempt to try and annex South Lebanon once again, basically. But so the war has implications politically in Lebanon and in Iran too. That's what I'm trying to say.
Mm, that's becoming more and more clear, Tim, as you say. I know that Stephen has his hand up, but maybe if you have a question or comment, Stephen, in just a sec, because there was another question here, and if you have time to stay on, Tim, and then we might round it off after this. A message from Kevin. Brilliant, Tim. Thank you for sharing your experiences and knowledge. What do you think a second phase of the war would look like if there is no ground invasion or an attempt by the US to take the Strait of Hormuz? What is to out for what has, I suppose, out for Trump? Is it more disinformation and claiming victory? Yeah. So what would the second phase look like if that were to happen? And then maybe before you even come to that, Stephen, if you want to come in, just so that Tim, you can respond, and only five minutes. I understand it's very early still there, Tim, and it's getting late here.
Thanks, Roisin. I'll keep it really short. First, Tim, thank you so much. My God, if your brain is working at that speed at 6:30 in the morning, I can't imagine what you're like once you really get into full swing. That was an extraordinary command of information. Just before you came on, we were discussing the comparison that a lot of people have made between the Suez Crisis in '59 and Trump's debacle. Um, is this the Suez moment for the American empire? And just your thoughts on that, because it strikes me that there's definite similarities, but there's also some key differences as well in that the British were essentially an empire already to some extent in managed decline in '59, and whereas the United States is an empire in deep denial, it seems.
Yeah, I think there's something in that Suez comparison in the sense that it marks a shift in power relations in the region. Of course, one of the main differences, the obvious difference, I suppose, is that the US was already the dominant player in the Anglo-American empire in the 50s. The Brits were definitely on the slide by that time anyway, so the Brits and the French being cut loose by the US in the mid 50s was uh, consistent with the rise of North American power, I suppose, at that time. What we're looking at now is something actually more substantial, and I tend to compare it with Vietnam actually, because Vietnam was a serious defeat for the US, and it was followed by or the failure of the what the Vietnamese called the American War in Vietnam, and what we tend to call the Vietnam War. That failure was followed by, well, a few things happened, of course. You remember Kissinger jumped ship from the Democrats to the Republicans because Nixon didn't want the Democrats having the benefit of the peace deal, the peace talks in Paris. But there was something called the Nixon Doctrine or the Guam Doctrine in 1969, and it was an attempt by Richard Nixon at the time, to put a good face on the US retreat from what they called Indochina. In other words, from a Pacific island, which is basically a little dependence of the US, the US president announced effectively a withdrawal of US forces from that part of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, after a substantial defeat inflicted on them after many, many years and a huge sacrifice by the Vietnamese people in particular, and tried to make a virtue out of it, saying, we are not retreating, we are realigning our forces, giving more responsibility to our Asian partners in the crusade against communism, which was sort of underwriting the Vietnam War. So that Nixon doctrine or Guam doctrine, I think is available to Trump, and indeed some right-wing US commentators have been talking about it for some time, since Trump's first term, really, because you recall all the talk that Trump made about NATO was the NATO partners weren't carrying their weight in financing their own security and so on and so on. It's a similar sort of rhetoric in a way, that if the US is to withdraw its occupation forces from Europe and Korea and Japan and wherever else they are, that there's a way to dress it up as some consolidation of US power without it being a retreat. And I think that in terms of off ramps for Trump, it's open to him. And this goes to the question of what the second round of war might look like too. Basically, that Trump and we've seen some important US commentators like what's his name? Anyway, are saying that Trump has been defeated effectively and his only option is surrender. But what's the surrender going to look like, or the retreat going to look like? I think there's going to be like a Trump doctrine, basically. Or if I was a Trump advisor, I'd be crafting the off ramp in this way, that you talk about a withdrawal from the Middle East, which Trump has been talking about, to be fair, since his first term. Remember, he wanted a withdrawal from Syria, didn't do it. He did a withdrawal from the northern part of Syria to the northeastern part of Syria. I went there and visited it after, and there were some differences there. So he had been talking about a realignment, a readjustment of forces. Some of them were moved into Iraq. Now they're being pulled out of Iraq, So this process has been going for some time. He's got the rhetoric about making the partners pay for their own security, which is part of that type of phenomenon, basically. Why are we carrying the burden of the security for whoever it is, the Europeans or the Japanese or the Saudis or whoever it is? That's of course he's been making the Gulf Cooperation Council partners pay a lot of money for these very expensive US weapon systems, which are proving themselves to have failed very badly. Basically, the Patriot missiles have been really shown to be very ineffective against a middle powers technological innovations, basically. Of course, innovations with the help of the Chinese and the Russians. And apparently, if you look at Scott Ritter's been saying that there is some stealth technology that the Chinese may be sharing with the Iranians, which may help them have stealth drones, for example, which is an innovation which the US hasn't got. I was surprised to see the US doesn't even have hypersonic missiles. Yemen has hypersonic missiles. Russia has them, China has them, Iran has them, Yemen has them. The US doesn't have hypersonic missiles. How backward are they in terms of some of this military technology? Certainly they spend a lot of money, more money on the military than anyone else, but we're seeing in real time that hasn't really helped them much against a significant middle power with technological innovation like Iran, which has been leading in some areas of missile and drone technology. So anyway, just to say that the second round then, still you would calculate that the strength of the US and the Israeli proxies is in air power, and using the refuge of the British military base in Cyprus and maybe some refuges in Europe still, and with the limiting factors of having to refuel some of those expensive and underperforming planes, which have been not doing so well in the first round. But they're going to try more air attacks, basically. On what, I'm not sure, because after they finished hitting schools and hospitals and other sites, they started hitting universities in Iran. I don't know what the next wave is, really. They haven't been able to. Someone said they had this 20th century war machine, basically, and they're confronting a 21st century installations like the underground missile factories and drone factories and so on. They haven't made much of a dent, it seems, on Iran's missile and drone factories, basically, but they can certainly still bomb from the air. They can start attacking the oil infrastructure, but that's going to be met with the reciprocal attacks from Iran on their proxies in the Persian Gulf. Basically, it's going to be more painful to the US so-called allies in the Persian Gulf than it will be for the Iranians in many respects. Remember, the Iranians have a railway to China. They have pipelines to the north. So they have some other options they can bring to bear, basically. But the US can bomb from the air. The Israelis can bomb from the air until their air force is wiped out. I think the Iranians may respond to some of the offshore havens for the Israeli warplanes, like Cyprus, for example. They've announced officially that it would include the Gerald Ford, which is in Crete, apparently. Not that the Gerald Ford is contributing much to their war effort at the moment, basically, but in other words, the Iranians have announced that they're going to look at the safe havens where the ships and the planes are being repaired and hosted and so on. And they may be more aggressive when it comes to striking farther afield down into the Indian Ocean. Those US warships are already a long way offshore, already certainly a long way away from the shore-based anti-ship missiles in the Persian Gulf. Basically, they didn't have to fire at the warships for the warships to stay a long way away, because basically the only use they've been serving is as a platform for this air power. So expect to see missile strikes, airstrikes. I still think there must be ambiguity in the US regime. Some people are saying they want to do a ground invasion. There must be ambiguity there, because there's a lot of advice that will be telling them this is going to look so bad. Okay, you'll make the Israelis happy, but having hundreds of body bags coming back from a failed invasion of Karg Island or Abu Musa Island or one of the other parts there is not going to be a good look. It's not going to help Trump claim he's winning. He's got to be looking a bit further afield to come up with something. And I suspect that this a Trump doctrine, of withdrawal and passing on, it's consistent with his past idea of getting the allies to fund their own security. It matches what Nixon did in 1969. I suspect we're heading down that route there. It's going to be some sort of strategic announcement. He would still like to have a trophy, like a lump of uranium or something like that, to hold up and say, look, this is what we extracted from Iran. Maybe the Iranians will give him something like that. I'm not sure, but the Iranians are very wary, as you can imagine now. They've got this internal pressure of people saying not just we're behind the military, but please don't betray us, our political leaders. We don't like the idea of what Mr. Zarif and Rouhani were talking about a decade ago. Basically, we don't want to go down that route. We know President Pezeshkian is close to that line of things, but wants to please the Western so-called partners. That the illusion of a partnership with Western partners that must have blown up many times in the last couple of years, but nevertheless, there's still that fear there that makes people in Iran say, stick firm to the principles that our martyrs died for. Basically, that they've got that now, that a lot of young men have died to defend this country, and so I really think we're looking at a Trump doctrine. It's going to be Guam version 2 or Nixon version 2, basically, because the retreat is already been enforced by Iran from the Persian Gulf. And of course, retreat from the Persian Gulf means, by the way, I might say, it's not to say this is going to be a clean retreat, because already the US is up in arms about the potential new Iraqi government as the US troops retreat. And they're worried about a more anti-US Iraqi government, because there's tremendous anti-US sentiment in Iraq, but they've been very damaged institutionally and culturally. And the US is still holding the purse strings on sales of Iraqi oil. And they're trying to use that very overtly and very bluntly in Trump manner to try and demand who's going to be allowed to form the next Iraqi government. They didn't want Mr. Nouri al-Maliki in there as prime minister again. They got rid of him some years ago. They don't want him back because the Dawa Party is one of the firmest pro-resistance political groups in the country. So they haven't given up entirely on the region, but they are already kicked out of the Persian Gulf. They have been exiting militarily from Iraq while holding onto the purse strings there, you know. So expect to see some sort of regional approach by way of an off-ramp on the part of Trump. I think he's going to he's tried it before and failed. It means there's going to be some split with the Israelis because the Israelis don't want him to do any sort of deal. They don't want any sort of US exit there. They're very happy with the US buildup that happened when they invaded Iraq more than 20 years ago, and there was hundreds of thousands of US troops in the Middle East. That's entirely different now. You're lucky to find a few thousand here and there, and that's not good for any sort of ground invasion. I suspect that I tend to doubt that Trump is going to try a ground invasion because I think, as vain and as narcissistic as he is, he'll be told how disastrous this is going to be. I could be wrong there. They're probably going to try something. That they built up a lot of forces. They brought a lot of planes. They brought a lot of troops in. They're ready for something. They're certainly capable of killing people, but I still have my doubts as to whether they're going to try a ground invasion. But I'm just speculating there.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks, Stephen and Kevin, for the questions to prompt that detailed response, Tim. We've taken up enough of your time. It's getting late here, and absolutely, like as Stephen said, you're a man on fire at 6 o'clock in the morning. So fair play to you.
Better for me than 10 at night.
Yeah, well, maybe in a way we're all a bit better in the morning, I think. We're starting to get the slump now, but Tim, we follow you on social media as well, and as I said about Professor Miranda, you can really see, you know, that there are some journalists and analysts and people of deep commitment to the cause like yourself who keep us informed, and we're very lucky actually to have this relationship with you where you're so dedicated. You came on after a text and I said, oh, we got the time wrong. So we deeply appreciate you being here, but also for everything that you're doing every day, because it's not just inspiring, Tim, it's information. It's about getting the correct information so that we can continue to translate that in our own way, within our own context here in Ireland. And of course, we have
your group's very important, Russia, and your group's very important, you know, because as you know, there's such a lot of confusion and such a lot of left liberal Western people who are trying to ingratiate themselves with the mainstream culture that it creates these problems that we've been talking about. Yeah. So your group is very important.
Thank you. Yeah. And that's all we want to do. We do not want to toe the liberal line, and we're not here to ingratiate ourselves or try and, you know, we're not numbers and we're not seeking popularity. We're seeking clarity. It's about clarity, creating a clear picture so that people can make up their own minds, and then that clear path, like someone else said about, you know, we need to have, it's an ideological war that's coming now, and we need to be at the front of that. That's our job as well, but we can't do that if people do not have, the masses do not have clarity in the first instance. So thank you to our Padre O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum panelists, Tommy McKerney and Barry Murray, who were speaking just before you come on there. Tim, they're here every week, and we're all very grateful for you being here. Thank you to our contributors, those who asked questions, engaged as well on the side panel, and who stayed on despite all our technical difficulties at the start, for being patient with me, and for you, Tim, for being forgiving of me of getting the time wrong, because that was my fault.
I'm sorry about that. I'm very sorry about that.
No, it's my fault.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll come back again anyway, Tim, and maybe just come back to Ireland. Come over to Ireland. It would be a wee bit easier.
Yes, well, I got an invitation to go to Italy actually because they're translating my book on Yemen in Italy. So I might be going to Italy in summer.
Okay, well, if you're in Europe, you're only a stone's throw away. Okay, everybody, good night, and we'll see you next week. Tim, all the best. Have a nice day, and everybody else, Hawaii. Victory to Iran. Long live the resistance, and Saoirse Dundon. Slán go fáil.
Hawaii.
Slán.
Bye.